Between the spring of 1843 and 1847, at least 7 young women from Mississippi's wealthiest cotton dynasties simply vanished. Not a single trace was left behind. No bodies were ever recovered, and not one official inquiry ever reached a conclusion. The families circulated tales of daughters shipped off to exclusive European academies, or married hastily to distant cousins in Charleston. Yet, tucked away in the obscure records of Adams County, there lies a single, leather-bound journal that reveals a horrifying alternative truth. It chronicles an ordeal so savage, so deliberately cold-blooded, that 3 ordinary men chose to risk everything to bring it to a halt. This is the actual history of the horrors committed within the massive barn at the Kellerman Estate, and the definitive reason Catherine Kellerman's remains were never located. Before we delve deeper into the secrets of the Kellerman Plantation, the darkest chapter Mississippi's elite society ever conspired to bury, I ask you to do one crucial thing. Subscribe to this channel, and be sure to activate that notification bell, because narratives like this, the kind they fought to erase from the history books, must be told. Also, drop a comment below, and tell me which state you are listening from. Let's track just how far this extraordinary story can reach. The terrifying secret of Catherine Kellerman's fate was ignited by her mother's crushing obsession, but it culminated in a scandalous exposure that ripped through the very foundations of the state's aristocracy. In the spring of 1843, Natchez, Mississippi, stood as a monument to Southern riches and the flawless facades its powerful residents maintained. The leading plantation families didn't just compete on cotton yields or land ownership. Their true contests lay in perfecting their family bloodlines, showcasing their daughters' grace, and wielding absolute, unchallenged authority over their properties. Along the high river bluffs, overlooking the mighty Mississippi, grand mansions rose like white marble temples. Each structure proclaimed its owner's status with imposing Greek columns and meticulously groomed gardens that demanded the continuous toil of dozens of enslaved laborers. The Kellerman Estate sprawled across nearly 4,000 acres of premium cotton land, situated about 15 miles northeast of Natchez proper. Lucinda Kellerman had inherited the vast property from her father in 1831, a rare feat that made her immensely wealthy, but also deeply resentful of the close scrutiny her independence invited. By the age of 42, she had crowned herself the unquestioned gatekeeper of social acceptance among the plantation aristocracy. Her formal dinners were legendary for their chilling precision. Silverware had to reflect the light at a specific angle. Floral arrangements were mandated to be in the precise French style she'd picked up during a brief stay in New Orleans. She kept her own figure rigidly thin through a punishing diet of vinegar water and extremely tight corseting, leaving her constantly short of breath, but undeniably the height of fashion. At 19, Catherine Kellerman embodied everything her mother despised. Where Lucinda was sharp-featured and angular, Catherine had inherited her late father's tendency toward a larger build. By 1843 standards, she was branded grotesquely obese. Her body's failure to achieve the slender ideal Lucinda revered was a constant source of shame. To her mother, Catherine's size was not a mere physical trait. It was viewed as an intentional defiance, a highly visible embarrassment, a blot on the esteemed Kellerman name that seemed to worsen every month. "She feeds herself like a common field hand," Lucinda would hiss to her closest acquaintances, her voice laced with pure revulsion. "I have given her every advantage to transform into a high society lady, and she repays me with this appalling display of self-indulgence." What Lucinda consistently overlooked, or perhaps deliberately suppressed, was that Catherine's weight gain had begun its dramatic escalation directly following the death of her father, Thomas Kellerman, in 1839, officially. The cause was listed as heart failure. The real, hushed truth, known only to a tight inner circle, was that Thomas had died in his study with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. He was clutching a letter addressed to Catherine, a letter, Lucinda, immediately incinerated before anyone else could read its contents. The vast Kellerman plantation was run with the same brutal efficiency Lucinda demanded in all aspects of her life. 237 enslaved individuals toiled in the cotton fields, the main house, the gardens, and the numerous outbuildings that kept the entire estate functioning. Among them were 3 men who would become central figures in Catherine's tragic narrative, though none could have predicted the roles thrust upon them. Joshua Fletcher, 34, was born on the estate and trained from his childhood years as a blacksmith. His powerful hands, heavily scarred from years of wielding a hammer, possessed an intimidating strength that made him invaluable for any heavy-duty work. He spoke little, observed everything, and silently logged every single act of cruelty he witnessed, preserving them like currency he might one day exchange for justice. The second man, Samuel Hayes, had been bought at an auction in Natchez in 1841. At 28, he had already survived ownership under 3 different, increasingly worse masters. What made Samuel particularly useful to Lucinda was his literacy. His former owner, a failed merchant, had taught Samuel to keep ledgers, a skill both rare and extremely dangerous for an enslaved person to possess. Lucinda saw its utility, employing Samuel to manage the plantation's grain inventory and livestock tallies, though always under her meticulous, watchful eye. The third was a boy of 16 named Daniel Cooper, purchased for his youthful vigor from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana. Daniel had witnessed horrors in his brief life that left him with a severe stutter and a deeply ingrained habit of flinching at sudden movements. Yet, he possessed an observational quality others missed, noting critical patterns and small details that would later prove pivotal. The barn where Catherine's story would reach its horrific climax stood at the eastern boundary of the main property. It was a massive structure, erected in 1820 specifically for storing cotton bales before river transport. By 1843, a newer storage facility had been built closer to the water, and this old barn was relegated to grain storage and equipment repair. It was strategically isolated from the main house by a thick cluster of live oaks, making it completely invisible from the mansion's windows, the perfect sanctuary for activities demanding absolute secrecy. Lucinda's journal, which was finally uncovered decades later in a trunk's hidden compartment, marks the precise moment her deadly strategy solidified. The entry, dated March 15, 1843, reads, "Today, I observed the Ashworth girl, once a heavy and unmarriageable creature, now completely transformed into a vision of delicate beauty." Mrs. Ashworth confidentially shared the secret of this miraculous alteration: labor, relentless, unceasing physical exertion. The body, when driven past its limits, consumes itself. It destroys the excess, revealing the shape God truly intended. Why should this simple cure only be available to the Ashworths? Why must my own daughter remain a living monument to gluttony when salvation is so easily achieved? I possess the means. I have the ideal location. I have the laborers who will unquestionably obey. Catherine's transformation begins tomorrow. What Lucinda consciously failed to record, but what would soon become devastatingly clear, was that Margaret Ashworth's transformation had come at a horrific price. The girl had developed a chronic, rattling cough no doctor could cure. Her hands shook without ceasing. Her eyes held a vacant, broken quality, suggesting something deep within her spirit had shattered. But she was undeniably thin, and in Lucinda Kellerman's narrow world, this was the only criterion that mattered. The social order of Natchez, in 1843, was built upon layers of intricate secrets and tacit agreements. Everyone possessed knowledge they pretended not to have. Everyone witnessed things they had mutually agreed not to see. This binding conspiracy of silence was not an accident. It was actively maintained through rigorous social engineering. To question a neighbor's private affairs was to instantly invite scrutiny onto your own. To express concern for a daughter's well-being was to imply that your own methods of child-rearing might be questionable. The entire system was self-protecting through shared complicity. Lucinda Kellerman had expertly forged her reputation on understanding and exploiting these unspoken covenants. She knew the exact point where she could push the boundaries of acceptable behavior without triggering a scandal. She knew which influential families would ask zero questions, which compliant doctors would sign off on health certificates without an examination, and which ministers would preach on the virtue of strict discipline without ever naming its methods. On March 16, 1843, Lucinda summoned Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel to the main house. It was highly unusual for field workers to be brought into the formal parlor, and the three men stood awkwardly among the fine furnishings and delicate porcelain, acutely conscious that their presence alone violated the strict boundaries that kept the plantation's dual realities separate. "Gentlemen," Lucinda began, her voice possessing the strained, false kindness she used when issuing non-negotiable orders, "I have a highly specialized duty for you. My daughter Catherine requires physical rehabilitation. She has grown weak and lazy, entirely unfit for the significant responsibilities that will one day fall to her as the mistress of this estate. You will supervise her daily work in the east barn. You will guarantee she labors from sunup to sundown. You will document her progress in a ledger I will furnish, and you will utter not a word of this to anyone, on pain of punishment. I trust I don't need to elaborate." The stark threat hung heavily in the air, unspoken but perfectly understood. Disobedience meant a lash, being sold downriver to the nightmarish sugar fields of Louisiana, or something far worse. But in Lucinda's cold eyes, there was something beyond the typical cruelty of an owner enforcing her will. There was a palpable sense of eagerness, almost a thrill, as though she was initiating a dangerous scientific experiment, whose results she was desperate to witness. Catherine herself was never consulted about this arrangement. On the morning of March 17th, she was taken from her bedroom by her mother's private maid and escorted to the barn. She was still wearing her nightdress beneath a simple, coarse-work dress Lucinda had specifically selected. The girl's face registered no shock, only a deep, weary resignation, suggesting this was merely the latest in a relentless series of humiliations her mother had engineered. The first morning inside the barn commenced with a mechanical precision that felt rehearsed, as if Lucinda had mapped out every single detail of Catherine's ordeal. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel had received their instructions with military clarity. Catherine was tasked with manually grinding corn, using the huge stone mill, hauling 50-pound sacks of grain from one side of the barn to the other, and splitting firewood until her hands were covered in blisters. The purpose of the labor was not practical output, but pure exhaustion. Every task was calibrated to push her physical limits while producing just enough useful product to justify the work, if anyone dared to inquire. The barn's acoustics amplified every single noise. The grinding stone against the corn echoed off the towering ceiling. Catherine's ragged, labored breathing became a slow, agonizing rhythm that the three men found themselves subconsciously matching. The old timber structure's creaking seemed to mark the passage of time like a tortured clock, each groan a reminder of the hours passing in brutal, identical repetition. What Samuel found most striking in those initial days was Catherine's profound silence. She never complained. She never begged for mercy. She didn't speak at all, save for a quiet request for water, which they were strictly ordered to ration. Her face remained entirely blank as she worked, as though her spirit had detached from her body and was observing the whole terrible scene from a distance. Lucinda would arrive every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, her silk skirts rustling loudly against the dirt floor as she circled her daughter like a prospective buyer inspecting livestock. She carried a leather-bound journal and meticulously recorded measurements, observations, and clinical assessments. Weight, estimated 195 pounds, she noted on March 20th. Face remains puffy. Arms show a barely noticeable reduction in circumference. Hands are developing calluses. Regrettable but essential. Temperament is appropriately subdued. The treatment is advancing as anticipated. But Lucinda's journal entries only captured one fragment of the true story. What she omitted were the private discussions she was having with other influential plantation mistresses who had daughters they deemed troublesome. Mrs. Helena Cartwright, whose daughter Rebecca had been caught reading abolitionist pamphlets smuggled from the North. Mrs. B. Tatrick Singleton, whose daughter Emma had refused 3 excellent marriage proposals, insisting she wanted to study medicine. Mrs. Constance Whitfield, whose daughter Sarah had been discovered secretly teaching enslaved children to read. These women would visit the Kellerman Estate under various covers: afternoon tea, garden tours, conversations about upcoming social events, but they would always ask to see the barn, and Lucinda always eagerly obliged, leading them through the oak grove to bear witness to Catherine's transformation. "You see," Lucinda would assert, gesturing toward her daughter's exhausted, bent-over form, "the body submits to discipline just as the spirit does. 3 weeks of rigorous labor, and already the excess mass is starting to diminish. Imagine the results after 3 months, 6 months, a full year." The visiting mothers diligently took notes. They pressed Lucinda for details, protocols, minimum duration, supervisory requirements. They inquired about specific dietary restrictions and whether Catherine was permitted any moments of rest. Lucinda responded to every query with the zeal of a scientist detailing a pivotal discovery. "No respite," she confirmed firmly. "Leisure is the root of this entire issue. Idleness and self-indulgence are sisters that breed only weakness in our daughters. Here, Catherine learns the genuine value of toil. She learns that comfort is something that must be earned. She learns that her physical form is not hers to destroy through gluttony." By the early days of April, the first of the other girls began to arrive at their respective destinations. Rebecca Cartwright was delivered to a barn on her family's land, monitored by 3 enslaved men who had been given an identical set of instructions as Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel. Emma Singleton followed 2 weeks later, quickly joined by Sarah Whitfield. Each family customized the process to their specific needs, but the cruel essence remained constant: isolation, punishing labor, and the methodical destruction of willpower disguised as physical betterment. What none of these elite mothers foresaw was the possibility that their daughters might establish a network of communication. While the plantations were geographically scattered, enslaved workers routinely moved between properties, serving as quiet conduits for messages and essential news. Daniel, who was occasionally dispatched to deliver grain to adjacent estates, started to notice a disturbing trend. Barns previously used for mere storage were suddenly declared strictly off. Young white women, who had been staples at society functions, were abruptly missing, their mothers offering vague excuses about illness or distant relatives. "There are others," Daniel whispered urgently to Samuel one evening as they locked up the Kellerman barn. "I saw them girls working just like Catherine, looking equally exhausted, equally terrified." Samuel felt a cold dread settle deep in his gut. What they were witnessing was not an isolated act of singular sadism. It was a carefully constructed and rapidly expanding system inside the confines of the barn. Something completely unforeseen was happening to Catherine. The labor was indeed intended to crush her, yet it also marked the first time in years she was free from her mother's relentless surveillance and corrosive criticism. In the barn, she was reduced to a simple body performing tasks. There were no mirrors to remind her of her failure to meet impossible beauty standards. There were no grand dinner parties where she was paraded as evidence of her mother's shame. Crucially, there were Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, who treated her with a guarded respect that genuinely surprised her. They never mocked her size. They never commented on her physical appearance. When she visibly struggled under a heavy load, Joshua would subtly position himself to silently shoulder some of the weight without making the assistance obvious. When her hands started to bleed from the rough-hewn wood, Samuel quietly produced clean strips of cloth and showed her how to bandage them to ward off infection. When she eventually stumbled from sheer exhaustion, Daniel would catch her, observing her without any hint of judgment. The first time Catherine spoke for any reason other than requesting water was on April 8th, 6 weeks into her confinement. She was resting during the short noon break, and Joshua was engaged in nearby equipment repairs. "Do you despise me?" she asked him softly. Joshua's hands froze on his tools. He deliberately avoided direct eye contact, knowing that any perceived insubordination could be fatal if observed. "No, miss," he replied carefully. "You should," Catherine insisted. "I am everything you want to hate. The daughter of the woman who owns you, living a life of privilege while you suffer. I would hate me." Joshua chose his words with the supreme caution of a man whose life depended on them. "Hate costs energy, miss. Energy is better spent on surviving." It was a stark, simple truth, but it served to unlock something vital within Catherine. For the first time, she began to see the three men not as mere extensions of her mother's will, but as fellow human beings trapped within the same horrific, relentless system. Though their particular forms of imprisonment were drastically different, their conversations grew longer, always conducted in guarded whispers during the short breaks, or in the dim early mornings before Lucinda's inspections. Catherine learned that Joshua had a wife and 2 children in the quarters, that Samuel had once lived in a large city and was surprisingly literate, possessing reading and writing skills superior to most white men. She learned that Daniel yearned for a freedom he might never truly know. In return, the men learned of Catherine's life inside the imposing mansion, a different kind of prison, the endless, stifling rules on demeanor and dress, the unrelenting criticism aimed at every mouthful of food, every spoken word, every breath. She described her isolation from other young people her age because her mother deemed her too shameful to be seen. "She wishes I would simply disappear," Catherine confessed one morning in May. "She desperately wants the daughter she conjured in her mind, not the one she actually has. I think she secretly hoped this work would kill me, allowing her to claim I died of a wasting illness and finally be rid of her terrible embarrassment." Samuel, who was listening while pretending to organize grain sacks, felt a deep chill at these words, as he had begun to harbor a similar suspicion. Lucinda's visits had grown less frequent, yet, when she did appear, she seemed more disappointed than satisfied by Catherine's mere survival. The girl was indeed losing weight, but the physical labor was also making her demonstrably stronger. Her arms were showing muscle definition. Her labored breathing had eased. She was adapting, not wasting away, which may have been Lucinda's true dark hope. The entries in Lucinda Kellerman's private journal grew steadily darker as spring transitioned into summer. Her clinical observations dissolved into overt frustration, then hardened into a chilling calculation, suggesting she was considering far more extreme measures. June 3, 1843, Catherine stubbornly persists in her corpulence despite the demanded rigors of labor. Weight reduction remains minimal. Perhaps the rations must be severely curtailed. Perhaps the work must be extended far into the night hours. The Cartwright girl, I am informed, has shown marked improvement. Why should Catherine prove to be an exception? What Lucinda remained ignorant of was that Joshua had been secretly supplementing Catherine's meager rations with food smuggled from the slave quarters. It wasn't much, but it was just enough to prevent the dangerous malnutrition that was weakening the other hidden girls. He took this enormous personal risk, sharing portions his own family desperately needed, because he had started to see something in Catherine that strongly reminded him of his own daughter, a fundamental innocence, a desperate desire to be seen as a human being and not just a flawed object, but other. More subtle dynamics were shifting within the barn that none of them had entirely anticipated. Catherine and Joshua began speaking with increasing openness during the long hours of work. What started as brief, logistical exchanges about tasks soon evolved into deep conversations about life, hope, and the utter absurdity of a world that so severely valued some lives over others based solely on the color of skin or the shape of a body. Your mother would have me savagely whipped for even looking at you directly, Joshua remarked one afternoon as they worked side by side to move a heavy, broken piece of machinery. But here, in this barn, laboring together, what is the actual difference between us? We both bleed. We both grow tired. We both yearn for freedom from the forces that bind us. Catherine had never truly considered the parallel before. Her confinement was obviously different from Joshua's, yet it remained confinement. She was not permitted to leave the barn. She possessed no power to make decisions about her own body or her life. She existed only as a problem to be corrected, a defect to be eliminated. The first time their touch was intentional rather than accidental occurred in late June. Catherine stumbled while lifting a sack of grain, her strength suddenly failing. Joshua caught her firmly, and for a heart-stopping moment, they were close enough to feel each other's shallow breath. Neither immediately moved away. The air between them seemed to suddenly thicken with equal parts perilous possibility and danger. "We shouldn't," Catherine whispered, but she did not step back. "No," Joshua concurred heavily. "We absolutely should not." Yet, neither retreated. In that solitary barn, completely cut off from the outside world, they had inadvertently created a clandestine space where the rigid rules of plantation society felt distant and, for a fleeting moment, negotiable. What transpired next was either an unfortunate inevitability, or perhaps a conscious choice they both made, fully aware of the horrific consequences, yet choosing a forbidden connection over their own safety. Their intimate relationship blossomed in stolen, brief moments, with Samuel and Daniel knowingly acting as their silent, unwitting guards, alerting them if anyone approached. What began as mutual comfort deepened into something genuine, a profound affection that transcended the utterly impossible circumstances of their stations. But secrets, tragically, have a way of surfacing, and by both Samuel and Daniel knew the full truth. Neither spoke of it directly, but they subtly adjusted their positions to offer more privacy, created tasks that required Catherine and Joshua to work in the back corner of the barn, and deliberately turned their attention elsewhere during the brief instances. The two sought each other's company. "This can only end badly," Samuel predicted to Daniel one evening after Catherine had been returned to the mansion and Joshua had departed for the quarters. There is no version of this story that concludes well. Daniel, who at 16 understood the world's deep cruelty in ways far beyond his years, simply nodded slowly. Perhaps, but maybe they truly deserve some measure of happiness, even if it must be brief. Perhaps that is the most any of us can ever hope for. Lucinda, entirely consumed with her growing operation of rehabilitation barns across the county, entirely failed to notice the dramatic changes occurring in her daughter. She was far too busy, meticulously documenting her methods, corresponding with wealthy, interested families as far away as Alabama and Georgia, and calculating the vast profits she might earn by consulting on how to reform wayward daughters. Her journal entry from July 12th reveals her grandiose ambitions, interest in the treatment. Methodology has dramatically exceeded all initial expectations. Mrs. Patricia Rutherford from Mobile has written, urgently requesting a detailed protocol. She has a daughter who insists on painting rather than focusing on suitable female accomplishments. Mrs. Vivian Caldwell from Savannah inquires about specific, long-term outcomes, expressing concern about a daughter who has developed an unseemly and dangerous interest in the family's sensitive financial affairs. The potential for systematic expansion is considerable. Perhaps a published treatise on the subject, The Correction of Female Indolence Through Measured Labor would be an appropriate title, but while Lucinda plotted the expansion of her cruel empire, Catherine's body was undergoing a profound change that had absolutely nothing to do with weight loss. By early August, she began to suffer from persistent morning sickness. At first, she dismissed it as the result of the poor diet and constant exhaustion, but when her monthly cycle failed to arrive, she grasped the terrifying truth. She confided in Joshua first during a quiet moment, while Samuel and Daniel were occupied at the far end of the barn. "I am with child," she whispered, her hand involuntarily moving to cup her lower stomach. "Your child?" Joshua's face cycled through a series of desperate expressions: shock, pure terror, and then a wave of profound tenderness that caused Catherine's eyes to flood with tears. But they both knew precisely what this meant. A pregnancy would be utterly impossible to conceal. Once Lucinda discovered it, the consequences would be catastrophic. "They will murder you," Catherine choked out, her voice breaking. "My mother will absolutely have you killed for this. Perhaps all three of you, just to ensure that no one ever speaks of it." Joshua desperately took her hands in his, a gesture so dangerous and yet so necessary that neither cared who might see. "Then we use the time we have to plan. We must find a way for us to get out of this." But any successful plan required critical information, and gathering information demanded extreme risk. Samuel, utilizing his valuable literacy and his occasional brief access to the plantation office, began to collect what he could: bills of sale, property deeds, correspondence between the allied plantations. He was searching for anything that might expose the full extent of Lucinda's dark network, any weakness they could potentially exploit. What he finally uncovered was far more terrible than he had ever imagined. Hidden in a ledger, misleadingly labeled household expenses, were entries suggesting that at least 4 other girls had undergone Lucinda's treatment before Catherine. Next to each girl's name was a chilling final entry: disposed of natural causes, or transferred to family in Texas, or, most unsettling, simply resolved. "What in God's name does resolved mean?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. When Samuel showed him the entries late one night, Samuel's expression was grim and hollow. "It means nothing good, Daniel. Nothing good at all." The horrifying pattern was now perfectly clear. Girls who failed to respond to the brutal treatment, who did not lose enough weight, or who proved too stubbornly rebellious, or simply vanished from the estate records. Their families were provided with convenient death certificates or letters explaining. They had been sent far away for their own benefit, but there were no marked graves, no forwarding addresses, no discernible trail to follow. Catherine is in far more danger than she realizes, Samuel concluded gravely, even if she wasn't carrying a child. If her mother simply concluded that the treatment had failed, she would be swiftly resolved, just like the others who vanished. They understood they had to act immediately, yet any attempt required critical resources they simply lacked: currency, authentic-looking documentation, and secure transportation. The very instruments of freedom were ruthlessly kept out of the hands of those who needed them most. It was Catherine who proposed the seemingly impossible solution. "My father's study," she revealed. Before he died, he kept cash hidden there: papers, 2 documents concerning the plantation. My mother never enters that room. She locked it immediately after his death, but I know precisely where the key is concealed. The desperate strategy they designed was fueled by despair and the minuscule hope that an improbable escape could somehow be achieved. Catherine would convincingly fake a severe flare-up of her illness from the labor, providing a necessary pretext to be moved back into the main house more frequently. During one of these visits, she would access her father's study and quickly retrieve all the cash and documents she could find. Armed with these resources, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel would attempt to procure counterfeit freedom papers and arrange passage to the north. But every single step of this plan demanded a perfect alignment of precision and sheer luck. The study was located on the mansion's second floor, requiring passage through areas where house servants were constantly working. The iron key itself was hidden in Lucinda's private bedroom, tucked inside an old music box that had belonged to Catherine's grandmother. Furthermore, the timing had to be flawless. Lucinda needed to be occupied elsewhere. The servants needed to be distracted, and the men remaining in the barn needed a solid alibi for Catherine's sudden departure. On August 17, 1843, they initiated the first phase. Catherine cried out, complaining of excruciating abdominal pain with such genuine conviction that even Samuel, who knew it was a performance, felt a spike of real concern. The act succeeded. Lucinda, annoyed by the interruption to her afternoon paperwork, immediately ordered Catherine to be taken to the mansion and confined to her room. If she is merely feigning illness, she will return to the barn tomorrow for double the labor, Lucinda declared icily. If she is truly sick, Dr. Harrison will examine her and dispense the appropriate treatment. The mention of the doctor terrified Catherine. Any medical examination would instantly expose her pregnancy. She had, perhaps, 24 hours to retrieve the contents of the study and return to the barn before her condition became impossible to hide. That evening, while Lucinda was at a dinner party at a neighboring plantation, Catherine waited for the house to settle into its deep nightly rhythm. She knew the routines intimately. The house servants would conclude their duties by 9 p.m. Her mother's personal maid would retire by 10 p.m., and the house would remain quiet until the kitchen staff began work at 5 a.m. She had a narrow 7-hour window. The music box was exactly where she remembered, resting on Lucinda's ornate dressing table. Catherine's hands trembled as she opened the delicate lid, wincing at the tinkling, gentle melody that seemed deafening in the profound silence. The key was there, small, made of iron, and tied to a ribbon that had faded from vibrant blue to dull gray. Her father's study was heavy with the scent of aged leather and pipe tobacco, familiar aromas that yanked her back to a time before everything had gone wrong, before her father's baffling death, before her mother's cruelty found its fullest expression. Catherine allowed herself one fleeting moment of overwhelming grief before forcing her focus back to the immediate task. The money was exactly where her father had shown her years ago, hidden in a false bottom beneath a desk drawer. $300 in assorted bills, a veritable fortune that could purchase passage north and potentially secure a new beginning. But it was the documents she uncovered that truly stunned her. Letters, dozens of them, dating back to 1839. Letters from her father to a lawyer in Philadelphia, detailing his profound plans to manumit all enslaved people on the Kellerman property. Letters chronicling his increasing horror at the institution of slavery, his moral awakening, and his absolute resolution to act on his conscience, regardless of the staggering social or financial cost. And one final, unsealed letter, addressed directly to Catherine herself. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I have tragically failed to find the courage I needed in life, and perhaps found it only in death. Your mother will tell you I died of heart failure, and in a sense, perhaps I did. My heart failed to be brave enough to finally stand against the wickedness I have been complicit in for so long. I cannot legally free those I have enslaved while I live, for your mother will use every legal avenue to stop me. But I can ensure that upon my death, the means for their freedom is at hand. The money in this drawer is for you, but I sincerely hope you will use it, as I could not, to assist those who deserve freedom to finally attain it. Forgive me for my cowardice. Forgive me for abandoning you alone with your mother's cruelty. You deserved a better father. They deserved a better owner. I deserved a better soul. Catherine stood paralyzed in the dark study, her father's words blurring through her hot tears. He had not died of heart failure. He had tragically taken his own life, overwhelmed by debilitating guilt and the sheer impossibility of changing the monstrous system he had benefited from. And Lucinda had ruthlessly concealed this truth, burned the final letter, and locked away every shred of evidence of his change of heart. She quickly took the money and the letters. But then she found one more document, her father's will, which had never been officially probated or executed. In it, he bequeathed the entire plantation, not to Lucinda, but directly to Catherine, with the explicit instruction that all enslaved individuals were to be immediately freed upon his demise. Lucinda had hidden this crucial document, continuing to run the plantation as though she had legally inherited it, forging her dead husband's signature on official documents to maintain absolute control. This was the leverage they desperately needed. This was the irrefutable proof that could destroy Lucinda's authority, challenging the entire legal foundation of her power, but utilizing it would require access to the complex legal system, to lawyers and courts that would never take seriously the word of an enslaved man or an obese daughter her mother had already dismissed as incompetent. Catherine returned to her bedroom just as the first light began to pierce the sky. She swiftly hid the explosive documents and the money in the lining of a thick winter coat hanging in her wardrobe, certain that Lucinda would never search there during the summer months. The next morning, she declared herself fully recovered and ready to return to the barn. Lucinda, still suspicious but lacking proof of any deception, grudgingly agreed, but with a severe warning that sent a shiver down Catherine's spine. Dr. Harrison will be visiting the barn tomorrow to thoroughly assess your physical condition, Lucinda announced. He has expressed concern that the labor may be too strenuous. I have assured him that you are thriving under this regimen, and I expect you to confirm this. Any suggestion otherwise will result in consequences you will most certainly regret. The doctor's arrival meant immediate discovery. It meant the abrupt end of everything they had hoped for. They had perhaps a mere 24 hours to execute their plan. When Catherine returned to the barn and revealed what she had found, all four understood they had crossed an irreversible line. They now possessed tools that could fundamentally challenge Lucinda's power, but using those tools demanded escaping the plantation, reaching outside authorities who might listen, and surviving long enough to reveal their astonishing story. "We leave tonight," Joshua stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that seemed to defy their perilous situation. "All four of us. We take the cash, the papers, and we run." "They will hunt us relentlessly," Samuel cautioned. "Every slave patrol in Mississippi will be searching for 3 runaway enslaved men and a white woman. We won't make it 10 miles. But Catherine had an ingenious idea, one born from years of watching her mother's meticulous manipulation of societal appearances. "We won't be running. We will be traveling. I will be a widow, journeying with my servants to visit family in Kentucky. The money will pay for travel documents from a forger in Natchez. My father's letters will confirm my identity if questioned. We simply need to reach the river and book passage on a steamboat heading north." It was a plan riddled with 1,000 potential failures, yet it was the only one they possessed. The preparations for their daring escape consumed the remaining daylight hours. Each of them had critical tasks that had to be performed without arousing any suspicion. A careful choreography of normalcy, performed on a foundation of sheer terror. Samuel's role was the most dangerous. He would need to enter Natchez after dark and locate a forger known only as Crawford, a free black man who operated from a warehouse near the riverfront. The forger's services were notoriously expensive, and finding him required navigating a city that became intensely hostile to any black person after sundown. Samuel would carry $50 of Catherine's money, enough to purchase basic travel papers, but not so much that losing it would instantly doom the entire operation. Joshua concentrated on gathering the essential supplies for the journey, food that would keep, appropriate clothing for travel, and, most crucially, weapons. He managed to secure 2 small knives from the plantation's tool shed, expertly hiding them in the barn's rafters, where they would evade any quick inspection. They were paltry weapons against rifles, but they were something. Daniel's task was to construct a credible alibi. He would remain behind at the barn after the others departed. painstakingly maintaining the illusion that Catherine was still confined there. In the morning, when Lucinda arrived for her inspection and discovered Catherine gone, Daniel would claim she had escaped during the night, overpowering him and fleeing alone. It was a story that would inevitably earn him punishment, possibly a severe one, but it would buy the others crucial time before the general alarm was sounded. The 16-year-old accepted this terrible role with a profound seriousness that broke Catherine's heart. "I will say she threatened me with a tool," Daniel reasoned, working out the specifics of his story. "That she was crazed, that I feared for my life. They will readily believe a white woman could frighten me. They will believe I am a coward. Let them believe it." Catherine spent the afternoon quietly writing letters, one to her father, which he would never read, telling him she had found his hidden will and finally understood his final act, one to Daniel, thanking him for his terrifying sacrifice and promising that if she survived, she would certainly return for him, and one to her mother, though this one she had no intention of mailing. In it, she itemized every single cruelty, every humiliation, every moment of her 19 years, when Lucinda had prioritized outward appearance over genuine love, and control over true compassion. "I need her to know," Catherine insisted as she sealed this final letter. "Even if we fail, even if they catch us and murder us, I need her to know that I finally saw her for what she truly is. Not a mother, not even a person, just a hollow shell wrapped in expensive fabric, tragically mistaking cruelty for strength. Just when we believed the horror in Mississippi couldn't get worse, it intensifies. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates a dark mystery. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because what they found waiting for them in Natchez would change absolutely everything. Samuel set off toward Natchez as the sun dipped below the horizon, slipping away from the plantation with the practiced stealth of someone who had long since mastered moving through the world invisibly. The 8-mile journey would take him 3 grueling hours on foot, following obscure paths that avoided the main roads and the patrols that watched them in the barn. Catherine, Joshua, and Daniel waited. The silence was suffocating, each minute stretching into what felt like an hour. They had completed every possible preparation. But preparation could not account for the thousands of variables utterly beyond their control. What if Samuel couldn't locate the forger? What if the documents were not convincing enough? What if Lucinda decided to inspect the barn unexpectedly? It was during this harrowing wait that Joshua finally addressed the painful subject they had all deliberately avoided. "If we are caught, they will kill me. Samuel and Daniel, too. They will make agonizing examples of us. But you, Catherine, they might allow you to live. If it comes to that moment, if we are cornered, you must deny everything. Say we kidnapped you, forced you to help us. You must save yourself." Catherine's response was immediate and fierce. "I will not. We survive together, or we fail together. I have spent my entire life being ordered what to do, who to be, how to exist for the comfort of others. This is the first decision that is truly mine. I choose you. I choose this, whatever comes." The words hung powerfully between them, an explicit declaration and a final farewell in equal measure. Joshua pulled her close, and they stood together in the darkness, feeling the crushing weight of the impossible choice they had made. Daniel, watching from his position near the door, felt tears he could not fully comprehend. He was witnessing something that should have been impossible in their world. Genuine love, crossing a societal chasm that the entire social structure was viciously designed to prevent. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Like watching flowers bloom in a burning building, Samuel returned just before midnight, and the relief washing over his face spoke of success before he uttered a single word. "Crawford sends his regards," he reported, producing a slim packet of documents from inside his shirt. Travel papers for Mrs. Catherine Kellerman, widow, traveling with 3 servants to Louisville, Kentucky. He included letters of introduction to a hotel in Natchez and a bill of passage for the steamboat. It cost every penny of the $50, but he does excellent work. The papers will pass inspection unless someone examines them too closely. They studied the documents by the weak candlelight. The forgery was remarkably executed, complete with official-looking seals and signatures that would mean nothing to most inspectors, but would instantly create the vital appearance of legitimacy. Catherine was listed as the widow of James Kellerman, her fictional husband, who had tragically died of yellow fever in New Orleans. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel were listed as her property, valued at $3,000 total, being transported north for sale to settle her late husband's debts. The profound irony of the papers was not lost on any of them. Traveling as free people would instantly draw suspicion, but traveling as owner and property, they could move through Mississippi's checkpoints with relative ease. The very system that enslaved them would be the tool of their escape. "We leave in 2 hours, Catherine decided. "The roads will be quietest between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. We will walk to Natchez, staying off the main road. At dawn, we will present ourselves at the steamboat office as travelers who arrived late and seek passage on the earliest boat heading north." The plan was fundamentally sound, but as they prepared to depart, Daniel's quiet voice stopped them cold. "Miss Catherine, there is something you need to know. Something I saw, but did not speak of until now." They all turned to face him, and the boy's face betrayed a fear that transcended their immediate danger. "The other girls," Daniel said slowly, "the ones in the barns on other plantations. I was sent to deliver grain to the Cartwright place last week. The barn there, where Miss Rebecca was kept, was completely deserted. Not just empty of her, but fully sanitized. Scrubbed down as though someone was erasing all evidence. I asked one of the Cartwright workers what had become of the girl. He refused to say a word, but he looked at me with such overwhelming pity. That kind of look only ever means one thing." The awful implication descended upon them like a thick shroud. Rebecca Cartwright, the very first of the other young women forced into Lucinda's brutal regimen, was not transferred, not sent to relatives. She was gone in a way that demanded a barn be meticulously cleaned of all proof. "How many?" Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. "How many others?" "I cannot say for certain, miss," Daniel admitted softly. "But I have personally seen 3 barns that were suddenly emptied and scrubbed clean. Cartwright, Singleton, and Whitfield. All of them started after your mother paid a visit. All of them ended the same exact way." Catherine felt a surge of nausea. Her mother hadn't merely been conducting a private experiment. She had engineered a systematic plot that was murdering young women across the county, all sanctified by the quest for physical perfection and social acceptance. And the desperate families, obsessed with correcting their daughters' perceived flaws, had been complicit in their deaths. "We can't just secure our own safety," Catherine declared, her voice trembling with a mixture of raw rage and consuming grief. "We are compelled to expose all of it, the treatments, the deaths, absolutely everything." But Joshua shook his head slowly, his expression etched with pain. "Catherine, if we try to expose this before we are safely beyond their reach, we will be dead before anyone in power even bothers to listen. We must survive first. We must reach people who have the authority to conduct a proper investigation. Then, and only then, can we pursue justice." He was agonizingly right, and Catherine knew it. But the bitter knowledge that they were abandoning Daniel, that other girls might still be suffering even as they made their escape, made her feel terrifyingly complicit in the very evil she was trying to destroy. They quickly gathered their meager collection of supplies, the documents, the remaining cash, the 2 knives, and a small quantity of dry food. Catherine took one final, personal item, the letter she had written to her mother. She would not mail it, but she would keep it as a permanent, chilling record of every wicked thing Lucinda had perpetrated. The farewell to Daniel was kept painfully brief, as anything longer would have shattered their resolve completely. The boy stood framed in the barn door, and Catherine embraced him fiercely, this child who was sacrificing his safety for theirs. "I promise I will return for you," she pledged. "When we are secure, when we have the power to act decisively, I will come back. You will never be forgotten." Daniel merely nodded, utterly unable to speak. He watched as the three of them silently slipped into the overwhelming darkness, vanishing into the dense grove of live oaks that had concealed so many of the barn's terrible secrets. The arduous walk to Natchez took a grueling 4 hours. Not the 3 they had estimated. They moved with extreme caution, halting frequently to strain their ears for the sounds of patrols or other travelers. The night was moonless, which aided their concealment, but made the narrow path dangerously treacherous. Catherine, completely unaccustomed to walking such long distances, struggled to keep pace, yet she pushed herself forward, driven equally by blinding terror and fierce determination. They reached the outskirts of Natchez, just as the sky began to lighten. The city was already coming to life. Early morning workers heading to the docks. Shopkeepers reluctantly opening their doors. Catherine used some of their precious, limited water to wash her face and hands, desperately attempting to look like a respectable widow, instead of a desperate fugitive who had spent the night trekking through the woods. The steamboat office occupied a highly visible location on the waterfront, its windows already illuminated by glowing lamplight. Inside, a single clerk sat behind a heavy desk, reviewing manifests and passenger lists. He glanced up as they entered, his expression shifting from detached professional courtesy to mild, if contained, surprise as he took in the unusual group, a young woman, clearly gentry despite her rumpled dress, accompanied by 3 enslaved men. "Good morning, madam," the clerk said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone strictly trained to serve the wealthy without question. "How may I assist you?" Catherine had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in her mind, but now that it was actually happening, her voice almost failed her. She forced herself to meet the clerk's eyes directly, channeling every last ounce of her mother's imperious, demanding confidence. "I require passage to Louisville on your earliest available departure," she stated clearly, placing the forged travel documents onto the desk. "My servants and I have endured a difficult journey, and I wish to complete our travels with all possible haste." The clerk examined the papers with meticulous, professional thoroughness. Catherine's heart was pounding so violently, she felt certain he could hear it. Directly behind her, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel stood perfectly still, their heads appropriately bowed, playing their roles flawlessly. "The Morning Star departs at 8 o'clock, the clerk finally confirmed. "I can arrange a private cabin for you, madam, and quarters for your property in the cargo hold." "That will be acceptable," Catherine replied, even though the word property made her stomach clench violently. She counted out the money from her small purse, watching the clerk's face remain entirely neutral as he processed the transaction. "Welcome aboard the Morning Star, Mrs. Kellerman," he concluded, handing her the tickets. "May your journey be peaceful." They had done it. In less than 3 hours, they would be on a steamboat heading north away from Mississippi, away from Lucinda, away from the barn and the horror it represented. Catherine allowed herself the smallest, briefest breath of hope, but as they exited the office and walked toward the dock where the Morning Star was being loaded, Samuel gently touched her arm. "Miss Catherine," he whispered urgently, "we are being watched." She followed his subtle gaze to a man loitering near a warehouse, dressed in the rough-spun clothes of a river worker. But his posture was wrong, far too alert, too intensely focused on them specifically. As their eyes briefly met, he spun away and walked quickly toward the main street. "Slave catcher," Joshua breathed, his voice low. He recognized something. "We must board immediately." They quickened their pace toward the gangplank, but moving quickly only drew more attention. Other workers began to notice, their conversations abruptly pausing as the unusual group passed. Catherine felt the suffocating weight of intense scrutiny, the questions visibly forming in the minds surrounding them. The Morning Star's captain stood at the top of the gangplank, checking passengers against his manifest. He was an older man with a deeply weathered face that had seen decades of relentless river travel. His eyes narrowed suspiciously as they approached. "Mrs. Kellerman," he queried, examining her ticket, "you are traveling alone with 3 male servants." "My husband recently passed away," Catherine responded, her voice steady despite her mounting terror. "I am returning to family in Kentucky. These men are being transported for sale to settle pressing debts." The captain's gaze moved slowly to Joshua, then Samuel, then Daniel. Something flickered in his aged expression, a suspicion that Catherine could not precisely identify, but could certainly feel. "Board quickly," he finally commanded. "We depart in 1 hour." They hurried up the gangplank, and Catherine did not allow herself to look back at the city of Natchez until they reached the main deck. When she did, her blood ran instantly cold. The man who had been watching them was now speaking urgently to 2 other men, one of whom was already mounted on horseback. The rider instantly turned his horse and galloped at full speed down the road, leading back toward the plantations. "They are going to alert my mother," Catherine gasped. "We have barely an hour before she arrives with irrefutable proof that I am not a widow, that these papers are forged, that we are all fugitives." Joshua's jaw tightened visibly. "Then we must pray. The captain values his fixed schedule more than he values helping a furious plantation mistress." They were shown to Catherine's cabana, small but clean room with a single bed and a small porthole window overlooking the river. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel were directed to the noisy cargo hold, but the captain's mate who escorted them seemed agitated, allowing them to linger near Catherine's cabin longer than protocol would normally permit. "Something isn't right," Samuel whispered quietly. "The crew knows something. I can see it in the way they look at us." Time crawled excruciatingly slow. Catherine watched anxiously through the porthole as cargo was loaded, as passengers boarded, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Every minute brought them closer to their scheduled departure, but also perilously closer to discovery. At 7:30, a sudden commotion on the dock violently drew her attention. Lucinda had arrived, and she had not come alone. Behind her ornate carriage were 3 men on horseback, including the county sheriff and a group of armed plantation workers carrying rifles. Catherine's mother descended from the carriage with terrible, practiced grace, her face a chilling mask of cold fury. She strode directly up to the captain, and although Catherine could not make out the precise words of the conversation, she could clearly see her mother's gestures, imperious, demanding, and utterly unyielding. The captain shook his head in reply. Lucinda's voice then rose sharply, carrying clearly across the expanse of water. "That girl is my daughter, and those men are stolen property." The captain inexplicably permitted Lucinda to board the vessel, a decision that instantly sealed their fate. Catherine heard the decisive footsteps on the deck, the voices growing louder, and she knew their fragile hour of hope had violently expired. The door to her cabin suddenly burst open. Lucinda stood framed dramatically in the doorway, and directly behind her were Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, held at gunpoint by the sheriff's armed men. "Did you truly believe you could escape?" Lucinda's voice was quiet, making it even more terrifying than if she had shrieked. "Did you genuinely think I wouldn't know? That I wouldn't track you down?" Catherine stood tall, and for the very first time in her life, she felt absolutely no fear of her mother, only a burning, righteous rage. "I found Father's will," Catherine stated. "I know exactly what you did. You stole the entire plantation. You forged documents. You built your empire on a foundation of lies and outright murder. Lucinda's expression remained utterly blank. Your father was a pathetic, weak man who would have destroyed everything our family laboriously built. I simply did what was necessary. You murdered those girls, Catherine accused. Rebecca, Emma, Sarah Howe, many others. How many daughters died in those barns, while you meticulously documented their suffering like a scientist studying insects? For the first time, something subtle flickered in Lucinda's isn't remorse, but a cold realization that Catherine knew far too much. The treatment was effective, Lucinda stated coldly. Some subjects simply lacked the constitution to survive it. Their families understood and were, in fact, grateful for my discretion in disposing of the evidence. The casual, devastating admission of murder, the complete and total absence of conscience, was more chilling than any threat. Catherine understood in that instant that her mother was not merely cruel. She was something profoundly beyond human feeling, a void wrapped meticulously in expensive silk. You will immediately return with me, Lucinda continued. These men will be publicly hanged for theft and assault. The documents you stole will be burned, and you, dear daughter, will complete your treatment because you are carrying the evidence of your shame in your very body. She knew. Somehow, Lucinda knew about the pregnancy. Dr. Harrison examined your room this morning, Lucinda said, reading Catherine's expression perfectly. He located certain evidence that hinted at your condition. He has confirmed my suspicions. So you see, my dear daughter, your situation is far worse than simple disobedience. Joshua violently lunged forward, but the sheriff's man instantly struck him with a rifle butt, driving him heavily to his knees. Blood streamed from a gash above his eye. Stop, Catherine screamed frantically. I will go with you. Just don't hurt them. Oh, they absolutely will be hurt, Lucinda promised. They will be made agonizing examples of. But first, they will tell me who else knows about your father's will. Who else has seen these documents? It was Samuel who spoke then, his voice cutting through the panic despite his terror. Many people know. We sent copies to lawyers in Philadelphia, to abolitionist groups in Boston, to newspapers in New York. Even if you kill us, even if you destroy Catherine, the truth is already spreading. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate, terrifying bluff, but it was delivered with such utter conviction that Lucinda's terrifying certainty wavered for the very first time. You are illiterate slaves, she scoffed, but her voice carried a telltale thread of doubt. You could not have. I can read and write better than most white men in this entire county, Samuel countered, his gaze unflinching. And I spent 3 weeks copying every document in your office while you planned your torture empire. Every forgery, every false death certificate, every letter arranging the disposal of bodies set, is all documented, all sent north, all waiting to be published. It was not true, but in that critical moment, watching her mother's face transform from cruel certainty to naked fear, Catherine instantly understood what Samuel was doing. He was buying them precious time, creating crippling doubt, forcing Lucinda to consider devastating consequences far beyond her immediate control. The sheriff stepped forward, his expression deeply troubled. Mrs. Kellerman, if there is indeed evidence of wrongdoing, if documents have been sent to authorities, ... There are no documents, Lucinda snapped back. This slave is lying to save his worthless life. But Catherine saw the quick calculation in her mother's eyes. Lucinda was frantically weighing the risks. If even a fraction of Samuel's claim was real, the exposure would destroy not just her reputation, but her freedom entirely. Murder could be concealed in Mississippi among the cooperative elite, but not if northern newspapers started asking pointed questions. Prove it, Lucinda demanded, her voice tight. Show me evidence these documents were truly sent. Samuel met her gaze steadily. The proof will arrive when the investigators do, perhaps in weeks, perhaps in days, but it will come. The tense standoff held for one prolonged, agonizing moment. Then Lucinda made her final decision. "Sheriff, take them all into custody. Lock them in the county jail until we can sort this matter out properly. If documents exist, we will find them. If they do not, these men will hang for their lies." As they were roughly led off the steamboat, Catherine managed to catch Joshua's eye. In that single, fleeting glance, she saw a final goodbye. They both understood the chilling reality of the county jail. It meant brutal torture to extract confessions. It meant death, quick or agonizingly slow, depending entirely on Lucinda's mood. But as they descended the gangplank, Catherine felt something fundamental shift within her. She was 19 years old, pregnant, and about to be imprisoned by her own mother. Yet, for the very first time in her life, she had made choices that were genuinely hers. She had loved whom she chose. She had fought for freedom. She had witnessed unbelievable courage in the face of impossible odds. The jail was a grim, stone building that reeked of dampness and utter despair. They were immediately separated. Catherine was confined to a small cell with a single barred window. Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel were taken to the dark lower level, where enslaved prisoners were typically held. Lucinda visited Catherine that same evening. She brought no food, no comfort, only a cold, clinical assessment. "You have cost me considerably," Lucinda stated. "The sheriff is full of questions. Other families are now nervous about their own treatments. You have created significant complications." "Good," Catherine replied, her voice firm. "I hope I have utterly destroyed everything you built on cruelty." Lucinda's smile was chillingly terrible. "You have only destroyed yourself. By tomorrow, I will have forcibly extracted confessions from those men about who helped them forge those documents. By next week, they will be dead and buried in unmarked graves. And you, dear daughter, will be returned to the barn until your unfortunate condition resolves itself. Dr. Harrison has agreed to supervise to ensure no complications arise." The devastating implication was perfectly clear. The pregnancy would be terminated, one way or another. Catherine would either survive the horrific process or join the unfortunate girls who had been resolved. "You cannot continue to get away with this," Catherine insisted. "Eventually someone will notice. Someone will investigate." "Who?" Lucinda retorted flatly. "The sheriff who relies entirely on my family's influence. The doctors who profit directly from my patronage. The families who are already deeply complicit in their own daughters' fates. No one is coming to rescue you, Catherine. There is only me, and whatever future I choose to assign you." She left, leaving Catherine alone with the darkness and the crushing weight of their failure. 3 agonizing days passed in absolute silence. Catherine heard nothing about Joshua, Samuel, or Daniel. The prison guards offered no answers to her questions. She was given the bare minimum of sustenance, water, and a piece of bread once daily, just enough to keep her alive, but offering no comfort whatsoever. On the 4th day, Daniel suddenly appeared at her cell window. His face was severely bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was undeniably alive. "Miss Catherine," he whispered urgently, "listen very carefully. We don't have much time." "Where are Joshua and Samuel?" Catherine asked, gripping the bars tightly. Daniel's heartbroken expression told her the truth before he even spoke the words. "Joshua is gone. They took him 2 nights ago, claiming he was being transferred, but we both know what that means." He paused, choking back a sob. "Samuel is still alive, but barely. They've been relentlessly questioning him." The grief was immediate, heavy, and crushing. Joshua was dead. The father of her child, the man who had shown her the true meaning of courage, was murdered. "I am so terribly sorry," Daniel continued, tears streaming down his battered face. "But Samuel, before they hurt him too badly, he managed to do something extraordinary. He really did send a letter north, not copies of all the documents, as he pretended, but one desperate letter to an abolitionist contact in Pennsylvania. He sent it weeks ago, the moment he first suspected the full extent of your mother's operation. He told them everything, about the secret barns, the missing girls, all of it. Catherine's heart leaped with a frantic, desperate hope. Will they come? Will anyone possibly believe a letter from him? I honestly don't know, Miss, Daniel admitted. But, Miss Catherine, you must survive until they do. Whatever terrible thing your mother plans, you have to endure it. Because if investigators arrive, and you are dead, there will be no one left to testify. You are the only witness they cannot dismiss as a lying slave. He was absolutely right. Her survival was no longer just about her own life. It was the final chance for justice, for Rebecca, Emma, Sarah, and all the others. It was the only way to expose the entire network of cruelty Lucinda had built. How do I survive? Catherine asked, her voice steadying. Agree to everything, Daniel instructed. Tell her you will be obedient. Make her believe that you are utterly broken, and then you wait. That evening, when Lucinda visited, Catherine flawlessly executed the role Daniel had described. She wept uncontrollably. She begged for forgiveness. She promised total obedience. The performance was utterly convincing because her tears were real, even if their source was burning rage rather than genuine remorse. Lucinda, satisfied that her defiant daughter had been adequately subdued, quickly arranged for Catherine's return to the estate, not back to the dreaded barn, but to a locked room in the main mansion where Dr. Harrison could attend to her, conditioned discreetly. The weeks that followed blurred into a miserable routine of isolation and profound fear. Catherine's pregnancy progressed, despite the minimal food and constant, severe stress. Dr. Harrison visited frequently, his examinations cold and purely clinical. He never once mentioned terminating the pregnancy, but Catherine quickly grasped the unspoken plan. She would be permitted to carry the child to full term. Then the baby would be taken away, secretly disposed of, and Catherine would be declared to have suffered a tragic, inexplicable stillbirth. But in late October, something suddenly changed. Dr. Harrison arrived with an unusual air of urgency, and Catherine overheard loud, frantic voices downstairs. Lucinda's tone carried a sharp edge of panic that Catherine had never heard before. The next morning, Catherine was moved again, this time hustled into a carriage heading back toward Natchez. No explanation was offered, but the sheer speed of the journey suggested desperation at the county courthouse. Catherine was led into a quiet room where two formally dressed men were waiting. They introduced themselves as investigators from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, sent to examine the claims made in a recent letter they had received from Mississippi. Mrs. Kellerman has been most cooperative, one investigator said, his tone suggesting he did not believe Lucinda's cooperation was genuine, but we require testimony from other witnesses. You are Catherine Kellerman, correct? Catherine looked directly at her mother, who was sitting rigid in a chair, her face a mask of intensely controlled fury. Then, she looked back at the investigators and made her final, definitive choice. I am, she confirmed, her voice ringing clear, and I have a great deal to tell you. The testimony lasted 4 hours. Catherine detailed everything: the barn, the forced labor, the other girls who had vanished, her father's hidden will, the systematic forgeries, and the multiple murders disguised as natural deaths. The investigators took meticulous notes, asked precise questions, and gradually, the full, terrifying scope of Lucinda's operation became chillingly clear when Catherine revealed her pregnancy and Joshua's execution. One investigator's expression darkened visibly. The man was murdered without any form of trial. My mother ordered it, Catherine confirmed flatly. The sheriff complied. His body was never returned. Lucinda remained completely silent throughout, her lawyer urgently whispering in her ear. But as the mountain of evidence grew, her certainty finally disintegrated. Documents were produced. Samuel, barely clinging to life, was carefully brought in to testify. Daniel courageously corroborated every single detail. The subsequent trial became one of Mississippi's most shocking scandals. Lucinda Kellerman was formally charged with multiple counts of murder, forgery, and theft of property. Other plantation families who had participated in the treatments immediately faced severe scrutiny. Some fled the state, others frantically destroyed evidence and claimed total ignorance. Lucinda was convicted in January 1844 and sentenced to life imprisonment. She died in the state prison 2 years later, her body buried in an unmarked grave, her name forever struck from the society pages. She had once so ruthlessly dominated. Catherine gave birth to a healthy son in February 1844. She named him Thomas Joshua, honoring both her father and the man she had loved, using her father's legitimate, unprobated will. She inherited the Kellerman plantation and immediately began the arduous process of manumission, freeing every enslaved person on the property. Samuel survived his devastating injuries and remained on the plantation as a paid worker, helping Catherine manage the complex transition. Daniel also stayed, finally pursuing the education that had been previously denied to him. Together, they built something truly unprecedented, a Mississippi plantation operated without slave labor, run by people who had once been considered mere property. The barn where Catherine had been imprisoned was completely torn down in the spring of 1844. In the earth beneath its massive foundations, they made a horrific discovery. 7 sets of human bones were buried in shallow, concealed graves. 7 girls who had failed to survive Lucinda's cruel treatment. 7 daughters whose families had tragically chosen to accept their deaths rather than question the methods that caused them. Catherine ensured each girl received a proper burial. Their names were permanently recorded, and their stories were finally told. Rebecca Cartwright, Emma Singleton, Sarah Whitfield, and for others whose identities took months to confirm, Abigail Henderson, Margaret Ashworth, Virginia Thorne, and Elena Pute. This mystery shows us the unsettling truth that the greatest horrors are never supernatural, but tragically human. They are born from a vile obsession with outward appearances, from the complete devaluing of human life, and from rigid systems that actively protect cruelty when it wears the convincing mask of respectability. What is your final takeaway from this story? Do you believe every part of Lucinda's horrific operation was truly revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this dark tale and want more horror stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves a compelling mystery.